Vor Station smelled like engine oil, alien food, and old deals gone bad. It sat at the edge of 3 trade routes, a massive rotating ring of metal and noise where ships docked and cargo changed hands every hour of every day. Dozens of species moved through its corridors, tall ones, small ones, ones that clicked when they walked and ones that floated just above the ground. Nobody paid much attention to anybody else. That was the rule of Vor Station. You minded your own business and you counted your credits. Cal Duran had been on the station for just under 7 months. He was 34 years old, originally from a small town in Ohio, and he had the kind of face that people forgot 10 minutes after meeting him. Medium height, medium build, brown hair that always looked like it needed a cut. He wore the same gray work shirt almost every day, with dark stains along the sleeves that never quite washed out no matter how many times he tried. He was not the kind of man who walked into a room and made people stop talking. He was the kind of man who fixed things, quietly, in the back, and got paid a little less than he deserved. He had been hired by the Vor Consortium, a mid-tier trading group run mostly by a species called the Valkyrie, as a maintenance technician. The job title sounded reasonable. The actual job was not. He cleaned fuel lines that other techs refused to touch. He crawled into access tunnels so narrow his shoulders scraped both walls. He repaired docking clamps at odd hours when the main hangar was cold and half dark. The Valkyrie engineers who worked alongside him were not unkind, exactly. They just did not think very much of him. Humans were new to the galactic community. New, and in the opinion of most species who had been out among the stars for centuries, not particularly impressive. Cal did not argue with this view. He just kept working. The Valkyrie themselves were tall, broad-shouldered creatures with dark scales along their necks and arms, golden eyes, and a habit of moving in ways that made them seem slightly too fast for a space their size. They were proud. They valued strength and lineage and the kind of wealth that came with long history. And nothing showed that wealth more clearly than a wing serpent. Wing serpents were the most prized possessions in Valkyrie culture. They were not quite animals and not quite machines. They were something in between, living creatures whose biology had evolved, over thousands of years, to include biomechanical elements. Their wings were part flesh and part articulated structure, with joints of hardened organic material and internal thermal systems that let them fly in the vacuum of certain low-atmosphere environments. They were bonded to their owners. They were expensive beyond what most species could imagine. And they were, in the eyes of every Valkyrie on Vor Station, a symbol of exactly who you were. Brax Vortu had 3 wing serpents. He was the trade lord who ran the consortium that employed Cal, a heavy-set Valkyrie with dark red scales and a way of speaking that made everything sound like an announcement. He wore long coats that cost more than Cal's entire year of wages, and he moved through the station like a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. They usually did. It was Brax Vortu who called the gathering in the main hangar on a slow Tuesday afternoon. Cal was in the middle of repairing a fuel pressure valve on the far side of the hangar when the crowd began to form. He did not pay much attention at first. Gatherings happened on Vor Station. Deals were made publicly, sometimes. Disputes were settled in view of witnesses. He kept working, listening to the sound of Vortu's voice carrying across the hangar floor, rising and falling with that particular rhythm that meant the man was performing for an audience. Then he heard his own name. He set down his wrench and turned around. There were maybe 60 or 70 beings gathered in a loose half-circle near the main floor. Valkyrie, mostly, but also a handful of other species, a few Drenathi merchants, 2 Servic diplomats in their pale blue travel suits, and a cluster of humans from the station's lower district who had no idea what was happening but had followed the crowd out of habit. Brax Vortu stood at the center, and beside him, on a heavy transport sled, lay a wing serpent. She was the palest thing Cal had ever seen on the station. Most wing serpents had rich color, deep blues, dark greens, the dark bronze tones that the Valkyrie prized most. This one was white. Not quite white, actually. More like white that had been washed out, left in the light too long. Her scales were the color of old paper. Her eyes, half open, were a very pale gray. She was large, longer than Cal was tall, with a wingspan that would have been impressive if her left wing had not been folded at a wrong angle, the joints fused in a way that made it look like someone had tried to close a door and jammed it halfway. She lay on the sled without moving. Her breathing was slow and careful, like something that had learned to be quiet. Vortu launched into a speech. Cal caught most of it. The winged serpent was named Sova. She was an albino, rare, which among the Valkyrie was not a compliment. Albino wing serpents were considered bad luck, a sign of weak lineage. Her left wing had been damaged in a docking accident 4 years ago. Multiple engineers had assessed her. The conclusion, every time, was the same. The wing was structurally dead. The joints were fused. She would never fly again. She had been kept in a rear storage pen for years, eating resources and producing nothing, because no one had wanted to be the one to end her. Vortu turned to Cal with a wide, open-armed gesture and a smile that the crowd clearly found very funny. He was gifting Sova to the human mechanic. The laughter started before Vortu finished the sentence. It moved through the crowd in waves, loud and genuine, the kind of laughter that comes from watching someone handed a problem with no solution. A broken, cursed creature, given to the species that could barely find its way around a galactic map. The joke was perfect, by their standards. Cal could see it on their faces, not cruelty, exactly. More like the easy amusement of people who already knew the ending. Cal stood at the edge of the crowd and said nothing. He looked at Vortu. He looked at the crowd. Then he looked at Sova. She had turned her head slightly in his direction. Her pale gray eyes were open now, watching him with an expression that was very hard to read. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. She looked, more than anything, like something that had been waiting a very long time for whatever came next. Cal walked across the hangar floor, past the laughing crowd, and stopped beside the transport sled. He crouched down so he was closer to her level. He looked at her left wing, the fused joints, the wrong angle, the years of stillness locked into the way she held herself. He put one hand, gently, on the side of her neck. She did not flinch. He said, quietly, in a voice that did not carry to the crowd, "All right, girl. Let's see what's actually wrong with you." The laughter in the hangar was still going. Cal did not hear it anymore. 3 days passed and Cal did not sleep much. He moved Sova out of the main hangar on the first night and set her up in one of the smaller maintenance bays near the station's lower ring, a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled like metal and old coolant, with yellow work lights along the ceiling that buzzed faintly when they first came on. It was not a comfortable space. But it was quiet, and it had enough room, and nobody came there unless they had a reason. That suited Cal fine. He spent the first day just watching her. Not in a strange way. He sat on a crate about 3 meters away with a notebook on his knee and a cup of cold coffee in his hand, and he looked at her. He watched how she breathed. He watched how she held the damaged wing, tight against her body, the joints locked in that wrong angle, a careful stillness that she had clearly practiced for years. He watched her eyes. They tracked him without fear. She knew he was there. She was deciding what to think about it. He talked to her while he watched. Nothing important. Just the kind of low, steady talking that a person does when they want something to know they are not a threat. He told her about the fuel valve he had fixed that morning. He told her the coffee on Vor Station was bad, but that he had found one vendor near Docking Bay 12 who made something almost tolerable if you added enough of the powdered creamer packets. He told her that her wing looked bad, but that bad did not always mean what people thought it meant. She listened. He was fairly sure of that. On the second day, he started the actual work. He had a basic field medical scanner, the kind that human field teams used in rough environments, good for bone density readings and internal imaging. The Valkyrie engineers who had assessed Sova before him had used standard bioscanners, the expensive calibrated tools that the consortium kept locked in the upper-level equipment rooms. Those scanners were built for Valkyrie veterinary work. They read wing serpent biology the way it was supposed to read, through a framework of what Valkyrie medicine already understood. Cal's scanner did not know what a wing serpent was supposed to look like. It just took pictures. He started at the base of the damaged wing, running the scanner slowly along each joint, checking the readouts on the small screen, making notes in his book. He was not a doctor. He was not a biologist. But he had spent 15 years working on engines and mechanical systems, and he had learned, more than anything else, that the first step to fixing something was to stop assuming you already knew what was wrong with it. The third Valkyrie report on Sova had called the wing structurally dead. The second one had said the joints were beyond repair. The first one, done shortly after the accident, had noted severe calcification of the primary and secondary joint structures and recommended extended rest. Nobody, in any of the 3 reports, had asked why the joints calcified. Cal found it on the second afternoon. He almost missed it, a small density reading, slightly off from the surrounding tissue, sitting deep inside the second joint of the left wing. Not organic. The scanner flagged it as a foreign material match. Metal composite, Valkyrie hull-grade alloy. Shrapnel. A small piece of hull plating from the docking accident, 4 years ago, still sitting inside Sova's wing. Nobody had found it. Or if they had found it, nobody had written it down. The body had done what bodies do when something sharp and foreign settles inside them. It had built walls around it. Layers of calcium, hardening slowly over months and then years, locking the joint tighter and tighter until nothing moved at all. The wing was not dead. It was defended. Cal sat back on his crate and looked at Sova. She was watching him with those pale gray eyes, very still. He said, "There is a piece of your old ship in there. Did you know that?" He said it quietly, the way he said most things. "That is what locked you up. Your own body was trying to protect you from it." She blinked slowly. He took that as acknowledgement. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and started drawing. He was not an artist. The diagrams were rough, boxes and lines and labels in his small handwriting. But he worked the way he always worked, component by component, breaking the problem into pieces he could understand. What was the shrapnel doing? Sitting inside a joint, causing irritation, causing calcium response. What did the calcium response do? Fused the joint. What did a fused joint mean mechanically? No range of motion, pressure buildup along the connected structures, neural sync ports probably corroded from disuse. Could the joint be unfused? Only if the calcium was removed. Could the calcium be removed without damaging the surrounding tissue? He did not know yet. He crossed out that last line and wrote, "Find out." He spent the next several hours in the small side room he used as an office, working through the Galactic zoological database on his tablet. Valkyrie wing serpent anatomy was not common knowledge. The Valkyrie did not share much with other species about their bonded animals, but there were academic records, research papers, observations filed by xenobiologists over the past 2 centuries. He read all of them that he could find. He cross-referenced the joint structure with mechanical hydraulic systems, the calcium composition with mineral buildup patterns he had seen in old coolant pipes, the neural sync port layout with electrical conduit systems he had worked on in ship engines. By the time the station lights shifted to their night cycle, he had 3 problems clearly identified and a rough plan for each one. First, the calcium needed to be dissolved, slowly and safely, without triggering further trauma response in Sova's body. Second, the shrapnel needed to come out, cleanly, once the calcium was soft enough. Third, the joints, once freed, would be vulnerable and weakened. They would need support while they recovered. None of the solutions he could see were in the standard Galactic supply catalog. At least not in the form he needed. He picked up his personal communicator and opened a message to his sister, Lena Duran, who was a nurse working at a hospital outside Columbus, Ohio. He thought for a moment about how to phrase the request. He typed, "Lena, I need some things sent out here. I know it is a long trip. I will explain later. Please don't tell Mom." Then he listed the items. A dental-grade calcium-dissolving compound used in human oral surgery procedures. Surgical-grade titanium mesh, the kind used to reinforce human bone repairs. And 1 tube of heavy-duty marine epoxy, the type he used to use on boat engines back home. He sent the message. He went back to the maintenance bay. Sova was lying with her head on her forelegs, eyes half closed. When she heard him come in, she opened them fully and watched him cross the room. He sat down on his crate. He poured the last of the bad coffee and did not drink it. "Help is coming," he said. "It will take about 2 weeks. We just have to be patient." Sova made no sound, but she shifted, slightly, so that she was angled more toward him. It was a small thing. Cal noticed it anyway. The next morning, a young Valkyrie engineer named Sevu came to the maintenance bay. He said he had heard a rumor that the human was doing something with the broken albino, and he had come to see. He was younger than most of the engineers on the station, with lighter scales than the older Valkyrie and a habit of tilting his head when he was thinking that made him look like he was hearing a sound nobody else could. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Cal's diagrams pinned to the wall, and then at the scanner readouts taped beside them, and then at Cal himself, who was currently lying on his back under Sova's damaged wing with a flashlight between his teeth. Sevu said, in careful common tongue, "What are you doing?" Cal slid out, took the flashlight out of his mouth, and said, "Looking. Want to see what I found." Sevu did not move for a moment. Then he stepped inside. He stood in front of Cal's diagrams for a long time. Cal watched him read, watched the head tilt, watched the moment when Sevu saw the shrapnel notation and went very still. "Nobody found this," Sevu said. It was not quite a question. "Nobody looked for it the right way," Cal said. Sevu looked at him. Then he looked at Sova. Then he looked back at the diagrams. He stayed for 2 more hours, asking questions Cal could not always answer and writing things down in his own notebook. When he finally left, he did not say anything else. But he came back the next morning. And the morning after that. The supply pod from Earth arrived 13 days later. The supply pod from Earth was small and slightly dented from the transit relay. It arrived at Vor Station's lower docking ring on a gray morning, tucked between 2 large cargo freighters like an afterthought. Cal was there when it came in. He signed for it himself, put it on a cart, and wheeled it back to the maintenance bay without telling anyone it had arrived. Inside, carefully packed in foam and sealed in transport bags, were the items he had asked for. The dental compound came in a set of small brown bottles with warning labels in 4 languages. The titanium mesh was rolled tight in a sterile sleeve, the same kind used in human hospitals for bone reconstruction surgeries. The marine epoxy was in a tube he recognized immediately, the blue and gray label, the kind he had used on his uncle's fishing boat years ago when he was 17 and learning what it meant to fix something properly. There was also a handwritten note from Lena. It was 3 pages long. The first page was instructions, careful, detailed, written in the same clear printing she used when she was being serious. Dosage timing for the calcium compound. Dilution ratios. What signs to watch for if the surrounding tissue showed a bad reaction. Notes on how long the dissolving process typically took in human patients, with a comment that she had no idea if the biology would translate, but that she had done her best to account for the differences based on the material he had sent her. The second page was a list of questions, mostly beginning with the words, "What exactly?" and ending with question marks. The third page said, "Please do not use the dental compound on an alien dragon without a medical license. Cal, I mean it. Also, the epoxy is food-grade resistant, but probably not biology-grade, so be careful. I love you. Call Mom." Cal folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood in the maintenance bay and looked at Sova, who was awake and watching him with the particular attention she gave to things she found interesting. Over the past 2 weeks, her behavior toward him had shifted in ways that were hard to describe but impossible to miss. She did not move much. She was still conserving energy, still careful with her body, but her eyes followed him constantly when he was in the room. When he left, she turned her head toward the door. When he came back, she turned it back toward him. Small things. Consistent things. Cal had started talking to her more. Not because he thought it was helping her, necessarily, but because the silence in the maintenance bay was very long and the work ahead was the kind that needed patience, and talking helped him stay patient. He spread Lena's instructions on his work table, set the bottles beside them, and began to plan. The treatment would take 12 days at minimum. Each morning, he would apply a carefully diluted version of the calcium compound to the fused joints using a custom applicator he built that afternoon from a large-gauge syringe and a short piece of copper tubing he bent to the right angle. The applicator let him place the compound precisely, directly onto the calcified surfaces, without spreading it wider than necessary. He tested the dilution ratio on a scrap of organic material he found in the station's xenobiology disposal bin, close enough in composition to the tissue he was working near to be a reasonable test. The material softened at the edges without breaking down. He wrote the result in his notebook and considered it acceptable. Sevu arrived the next morning before Cal had finished his coffee. The young engineer had become a fixture in the maintenance bay. He did not help, exactly. He was careful not to touch anything Cal was working on without asking, but he watched everything and asked questions constantly, the kind of questions that told Cal the Valkyrie had a thorough technical education but that nobody had ever taught him to think sideways about a problem. He wanted to understand why Cal was using a human dental tool on a Valkyrie wing serpent. He wanted to understand what the titanium mesh was for. He kept coming back to the same point, turning it over like a stone he kept finding in his pocket. The certified engineers said the wing was beyond repair, Sevu said on the third day of treatment, watching Cal apply the morning dose of compound with the copper tube applicator. 4 of them. They all agreed. They probably did, Cal said. You do not think they were wrong? Cal thought about it. I think they were using the right tools for the wrong question, he said. They asked what was broken. I asked what caused it. Sevu was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. By the 6th day, the results were visible. The calcification around the outer joint was retreating, not dramatically, not in a way that looked like a miracle, but measurably, steadily, the dense material softening and thinning in response to the compound. Cal documented it every morning with his scanner and taped the readouts to the wall in a row so he could track the progression. Sova let him work close to her wing now without any sign of tension. She watched the applicator with calm, steady eyes. Occasionally, when he was done, she would exhale through her nose in a long, slow breath that Cal had come to think of as a sigh. He told her that she had good manners for a creature with a wingspan wider than his apartment back home. She looked at him with the same expression she always used for his attempts at humor, which was no expression at all, which he had decided to interpret as polite tolerance. On the 9th day, he determined the joints were loose enough. Sevu was there when Cal set out the tools for the shrapnel removal. He had brought a more complete kit now than he started with, a pair of modified surgical clamps he had made by reshaping 2 standard mechanical grab tools in the station's fabrication room, small enough to work in the space between the joint structures, strong enough to hold without slipping. He had also made a second applicator for the flushing stage, to rinse the site once the shrapnel was out. It was quiet in the maintenance bay. The yellow lights hummed. Sova was lying very still, her damaged wing extended as far as it could go in its current state, which was not far, but was far enough. She had figured out, sometime in the past few days, what Cal was trying to do. He did not know exactly how she had figured it out. He just knew that she was cooperating in every way a creature without spoken language could cooperate. The shrapnel came free on the second careful attempt. It was smaller than Cal had expected, about the length of his thumbnail, dark gray, the edge still sharp after 4 years inside a living body. He held it up in the clamp and looked at it for a moment. A piece of Valkyrie hull plating. Probably part of the docking collar that had failed in the accident, a fragment flung out by the impact and driven into the joint before anyone realized what had happened. The sound Sova made when it came out was something neither Cal nor Sevu had heard before from a winged serpent. It was low and long, and the closest word Cal could find for it afterward was release. Not pain. Not distress. Something that had been held tightly for a very long time, letting go. Sevu said nothing. Cal flushed the site, checked the surrounding tissue, and began the reinforcement work. He cut the titanium mesh to shape, pressing it carefully into the now vulnerable joint cavities, working the marine epoxy, thinned to just the right consistency, as close to biology safe as he could manage, along the edges to hold it. He worked slowly. He worked carefully. When he was done, he sat back and stretched his shoulders and looked at what he had made. It was not beautiful. It was practical. A human mechanic solution to a problem that no one had been willing to look at long enough to understand. Cal checked the joint angle. He moved the wing, gently, a few degrees past where it had been locked. It moved. Sevu exhaled. It was a very small sound. But Cal noticed it. Day 11, Cal said, writing in his notebook. Range of motion increased. Reinforcement holding. Next step, wait. He looked up at Sova. She was looking back at him with those pale gray eyes. The piece of shrapnel sat on the work table between them, small and dark and finally out. You did good, Cal said. She blinked slowly. He had learned by now that this was her version of a nod. On the morning of the 14th day, Cal did not tell anyone what he was planning to do. He got up early, when the station was still in its dim pre-cycle light, and he went to the maintenance bay and sat with Sova for a while before anything else. She was already awake. She was almost always awake when he arrived now, as if she had a sense of when he was coming that was more reliable than a clock. He sat on his crate and drank his coffee, from the vendor near Docking Bay 12, which had become a habit, and she lay with her head up, watching the door and then watching him. He had spent the last 3 days doing careful range of motion checks on the repaired wing. Each day, the movement was a little easier, a little wider. The titanium mesh had integrated well with the surrounding tissue, Better than Cal had honestly expected, though he had not said this out loud because Sevu had been nervous enough without Cal adding to it. The joints were not perfect. They would probably never move quite like the right wing moved. But they moved. They moved freely and without the grinding resistance that had been there before, and when Cal measured the thermal output from the repaired structures, it matched what the right wing produced within a margin that felt, to a mechanic, like a success. He set down his empty cup and looked at Sova. "Today," he said. She lifted her head a little higher. Sevu arrived 20 minutes later, which Cal had expected. The young engineer had developed the instinct for when something important was about to happen in the maintenance bay, the same way a person learns to wake up just before their alarm goes off. He came through the door already holding his personal recording device, a small flat tool the size of a playing card that he had been carrying in his chest pocket for the past week. He said nothing when he came in. He just looked at Cal, and then at Sova, and then at the maintenance bay's far end, where the heavy inner door connected to the station's interior flight corridor. Cal walked to the controls for that door and entered the unlock sequence. The door slid open with a low mechanical sound. Beyond it was the flight corridor, a long, tall tunnel built into the station's inner ring, used for moving large cargo in zero-grav conditions. It was empty now. The lights along its ceiling ran far back into the distance, getting smaller, ending in a gray vanishing point. The space was wide enough. The height was enough. It smelled like circulated air and old metal. Cal stepped back from the door. He stood near Sevu, off to the side, and he did not speak and did not make any gesture toward Sova. He just left the door open. Sova stood up. It was the first time Cal had seen her stand fully upright in the 14 days he had known her. She was taller than he had registered from the ground. Her shoulder came to the top of his head, and when she extended her neck to look through the open door, she moved with a careful, deliberate grace that had nothing to do with the broken, still creature who had been lying on a transport sled 2 weeks ago. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Cal. She looked at the corridor again. Then she extended both wings. The left one caught the light differently than the right. The pale scales shifted where the titanium mesh sat beneath them, a faint structural outline that you could see if you knew what to look for. The wings spread wide, not perfectly, not with the easy snap of a healthy wing, but wide and level and fully extended all the way to the tip. The joints moved through the full arc of their range. Cal watched each one. He was counting, measuring, checking against what he knew was possible and what he had hoped for. Everything was in the right place. Sevu made a very small sound. Cal put a hand briefly on his arm, not a gesture of comfort, exactly, more the instinct to stay still and quiet, the same way you go still when something rare is happening in front of you. Sova launched. She went from standing to airborne in a single motion that was too fast to follow properly. One moment she was on the floor. The next she was in the corridor, her wings catching the circulation currents from the station's air system, her body banking left immediately as her repaired wing adjusted to its new range of motion. It was not graceful. The first few meters were uncertain. She listed hard to the left, the repaired wing working at a slightly different angle than the right, both of them making small rapid corrections that looked, to a mechanic watching, like a system recalibrating itself in real time. Cal's stomach dropped in the first second. Then it came back. Because she did not fall. She adjusted. The corrections happened faster, the angle leveled out, and she climbed. Not high, the corridor ceiling was not high enough for that, but forward and steady and with a rhythm that built and settled into something that looked, unmistakably, like flying. She made one wide circle around the full length of the corridor. Then another. Then a third, wider and more confident than the first two, the pale wings catching the light from the ceiling strips with every pass. When she came back and landed in front of Cal, the landing was clean. She stood there, breathing with some effort, her wings folding back slowly. She looked at Cal. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. There was nothing he needed to say that she did not already know. Sevu, standing behind him, had forgotten to breathe for approximately 30 seconds. He remembered to do it now. Then, without saying a word to Cal, he looked at the recording device in his hand, looked at the footage he had just captured, and uploaded it to the station's shared network. He did this before Cal could have stopped him, not that Cal would have stopped him. The first people arrived at the maintenance bay within 40 minutes. By the hour mark, the observation rail above the flight corridor was crowded. Word on Vor Station moved fast when it had something worth moving for. There were Veilcree from the upper consortium floors who had heard the name Sova and came with arms crossed and skeptical faces. There were humans from the lower district who had no specific understanding of what a winged serpent was, but understood from the energy in the corridors that something was happening. There were Drenathi merchants, 2 Servic in their pale blue suits, a group of engineering students from the station's training program, and a handful of beings whose species Cal could not readily identify. And there, at the far end of the rail, standing very still, was Brax Vortu. Cal had Sova fly again for the crowd. Not because he was performing for them, he would not have done it for that reason, but because Sova wanted to fly, and the corridor was there, and she had 4 years of being still to make up for. She flew 3 more passes. The second one was faster than the first. The third one was quieter, steadier, the repaired wing working smoothly now, the corrections barely visible to anyone who had not spent 2 weeks learning what her body language looked like when it was working hard. The crowd on the observation rail was silent for the third pass. Completely silent. Cal noticed this. When Sova landed again, she did not look at the crowd. She walked to Cal and lowered her head and rested it against his shoulder. It was a deliberate motion. Slow and clear. The kind of thing that left no room for interpretation. He heard the silence shift on the rail above him. A different kind of quiet, not the held breath of watching something surprising, but the particular stillness of Veilcree, who understood what they were seeing and needed a moment to process it. Sevu appeared at his elbow. He spoke very quietly. "She has chosen you," he said. "You understand what that means. A winged serpent who chooses does not unchoose. She is yours. There is no transfer. You cannot give her back, and no one can take her from you. She will stay with you until one of you dies. This is not a cultural rule. It is simply how they are made." Cal looked at Sova's pale head resting on his shoulder. She was warm. He could feel the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. He looked back at Sevu. "Okay," Cal said. "You understand what I just said?" "Yeah," Cal said. "Okay." Sevu stared at him for a moment. Then he shook his head and wrote something in his notebook. Up on the rail, Brax Vortu had not moved. His face was very still. He was a man who had spent his life making other people feel small, and he was standing in the aftermath of a joke that had turned inside out, in front of 60 witnesses and a recording that was already spreading beyond Vorstation's network. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The silence where the laughter used to be was louder than anything he could have said. Cal did not look at him. He put his hand on the side of Sova's neck, and she made that long, low sound again, the release sound, the one he had heard when the shrapnel came out, and he figured that was probably all the statement either of them needed to make.